College for having me here, and to the audience for coming to this occasion. What I want to do is, in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, which was almost exactly 4 weeks ago today, but we may add to that last Saturday in Denmark, the attempted murder of Lars Vilks, Swedish cartoonist, who did the famous Mohammed as a roundabout dog cartoon in 2008. So these things are happening more. What I want to concentrate on, and I don't want to take up most of the time in a presentation, but to set these things in a larger context, a global context, because most people in the West tend to notice these things only when they happen in the West. So if we're asked to look at sort of famous cases of where there's an eruption around blasphemy or apostasy or insulting Islam, things which may come to your mind correctly would be the murder of Theo van Gogh in the street in Amsterdam after he produced a documentary on the status of women in Muslim lands. You might remember he was killed, attempted beheading on the street in Amsterdam. That was over 10 years ago. Or if we would go back further, of course, the one which inaugurated the modern age of attempting to kill those accused of blasphemy is the fatwa by the Ayatollah Khomeini against the British Indian author Salman Rushdie, which fatwa, by the way, the Iranians said it no longer stands. Of course it stands. The only person who can remove it is the person who issues it. He's dead. So Rushdie is still under that threat. Other things, what we usually call the Danish cartoons, published by Yale and Posten in 2005, the Swedish cartoons I mentioned, with the affairs around the killing of the American ambassador in Libya, in Tripoli, more than last year. The film trailer, The Innocence of Muslims, which had been seen by about 3 people on the internet till that event took place. Pastor Terry Jones's threat to burn the Quran created a lot of fuss worldwide. His actual burning of a Quran 2 years later caused almost no stir. And the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the attack on Lars Vilks, or the response to Pope Benedict's Regensburg speech. So these things are going on regularly. They're increasing in number. And these are the ones which we're usually aware of. They happen closer to us. But one of the first points I want to make is these particular instances are markedly atypical of accusations of blasphemy or insulting Islam worldwide. In the book which Professor Gladder mentioned, Silenced, we survey accusations, sometimes by the government, but more often by private parties, accusations of insulting Islam or blasphemy in some 26 Muslim-majority countries and in about 14 Western countries. We cover thousands of cases involving millions of people. And so this is a worldwide global phenomenon, and the things of which we are aware are simply the tip of a very large iceberg. But if we look at trends worldwide, we firstly notice the number of such accusations and attacks are increasing. They've been increasing exponentially in the last 25 years. Also, we have a PowerPoint here. Excuse me. So it's a growing trend. You all heard that already. The events that get the attention, and we survey, and I mean millions of people. There are fatwas condemning people, the people of the Nuba Mountains, 600,000 of them, were condemned as apostates who should be killed by the Sudanese government, did this in 1993. But if we survey the trends of these types of accusations, firstly, the charges are usually vague. And this is even when there's a law on the books. In most cases, there isn't. A very partial list of accusations for which people have been physically attacked or killed or arrested are Here's some, we'll list about 65. Apostasy. As you know, ISIS in the Middle East, one of the things it does with anybody who disagrees with it, Muslims or whatever else, says, well, if you disagree with us, you're not a true Muslim, therefore you've left Islam, therefore you're an apostate, therefore we can kill you. And they kill you. So apostasy is used very vaguely. And insulting a heavenly religion, that's section 98F of the Egyptian Penal Code. Creating confusion amongst Muslims, that's an offense in Malaysia, it's an offense in Iran and a few other places. Imitating Christians, that will get you imprisoned in Iran. Harboring destructive thoughts, friendship with the enemies of God, or we have fighting against God. My view is if someone wants to fight against God, if I were a gambling man, I would take great odds on the winner, so why would you stop him? But anyway, fighting against God, dissension from religious dogma, and propagation of spiritual liberalism. The last two are offenses drawn from the Sharia code in Iran. And there are many others. But I just give this list very rapidly to give you a sense of the breadth of the things that we are talking about. Henceforth, in this lecture, I'm just going to use the term blasphemy as a shorthand for this entire list. So that's the first one. The accusations are usually extremely vague, even if there's a legal code, and very often there isn't. Second, the first is they're vague. Secondly, such accusations are often shaped by political manipulation. Just to give one example, as mentioned, and you probably remember, or maybe you don't, in 2005, the Danish newspaper, Jylland-Posten, which actually is the largest newspaper in Denmark, published a dozen cartoons. They're usually called cartoons of Muhammad. Most of them are not depictions of Muhammad. The background to this was that a children's book writer was commissioned to write a book on the life of Muhammad for children. This was meant to be a very respectful thing, had a life of Jesus, life of Buddha, and so on, and wanted illustrations for it, just drawing illustrations. In the entirety of Denmark, he could not find a cartoonist. She could not find a cartoonist to do that. And raised this thing with Flemming Rose, who was the cultural editor of Jylland-Posten, and he thought, we've got a problem here. We can't illustrate a children's book. And Rose also added he used to be based in Moscow. He's a foreign correspondent in the former Soviet Union. He said, I started to notice a phenomenon which we always knew about in Moscow. That is, if you start talking about a certain subject, people look around. Who might be here? Who's listening? And he says, that's what we're doing in Denmark right now. So hence those cartoons. So the cartoons came out in September 2005. And what happened? Anybody want to? That's not a rhetorical question. They came out September 2005. What happened in the weeks following? The answer is pretty well nothing. Danish Muslims, a variety of Danish Muslims, peacefully demonstrated outside the office of Jylland-Posten, said they shouldn't do that and they should apologize. This was a perfectly democratic response to perceived insult. But people now remember correctly killings of dozens of people in Nigeria, killings in Pakistan, killing in Afghanistan. But those took place in February 2006, 5 months afterwards. When the cartoons came out, there was no spontaneous upwelling of rage. What happened in the intervening 5 months is 3 radical imams from Denmark got these cartoons and added a few of their own, which were really nasty. The Jylland-Posten ones are pretty tame. And went around the Middle East showing them and saying, this is what they're saying about this. And then the organization of the Islamic Conference, an organization of some 56 countries and territories, at their meeting in Mecca, changed the agenda from dealing with terrorism to deal with what they called Islamophobia and insults to Islam. So out of that meeting in Mecca, hosted by the Saudis, came a plan of action, which involved demonstrations throughout the world, protests, boycotts of Danish and other products. So basically, 5 months after the cartoons came out, a variety of governments decided to make an issue of this and put a lot of time and money into it. That's when the eruption happened. So many of the things we're seeing are not just spontaneous eruptions. Of course, Muslims do get angry about these. But in most cases, if you get widespread demonstrations and death, that's usually because some governmental figures want that to happen and at least stoke it. Just a clarification here, by the way, I'm not saying, you will have often heard the phrase, oh, that's political, not religious. That's not what I'm saying. A thing can be political and religious too. You know, is the Christian Democratic Party, the governing party in Germany, is that political or religious? Well, obviously it's both. That's like saying, you know, is it blue or is it a foot long? Well, it could be both those things. So, but the only, you know, in order for a government to manipulate a sentiment, or for an organization like ISIS to manipulate a sentiment, the sentiment has to be there in the first place. You can't stoke people's religious beliefs unless they've got religious beliefs. So the religious sentiment has to be there in the first place. I'm not saying this is a myth, but I am saying there is political manipulation in order to make these things blow up. So, the third, while accusations from governments can be bad, that you're formally charged under a penal code, say in Pakistan, or under a Sharia code in Iran, the biggest danger, as we've seen from the attacks in the West, is usually not governments, but mobs, vigilantes, and terrorists. To give an example, Pakistan probably has the most stringent blasphemy codes in the world. And in their modern form, they were instituted starting under Zia al-Haq in the 1980s. Thousands of people have been accused. Hundreds of people have been imprisoned. No one has, and 2 out of the 3 major blasphemy codes carry the death penalty. Nobody has ever been, in the modern age, nobody's ever been executed in Pakistan for blasphemy. But there are hundreds of people dead. If you're accused of blasphemy, there's a good chance you will be killed immediately. Probably your best bet is to try and get arrested very quickly and put behind bars. But then you may get killed by the police, or the police will put you in a cell with a dozen other people and say you're a blasphemer and you die. Or in one case, 3 people, in this case 3 Christians, were acquitted of blasphemy accusations from the High Court in Punjab, and as they came out of the court, they were machine gunned to death. So there are ongoing deaths in Pakistan all the time. But it's either extra legal violence by the police or mobs or vigilantes. Governments are bad, but vigilantism is the worst. The 4th major finding is who tends to be the victims. There are 4 major categories of victims. Summarizing them quickly, they are, I'll call them post-Islamic beliefs. It's not a good term, but in particular in this context, Baha'is and Ahmadis. That is, people who either believe or are thought by many Muslims to believe that there has been a prophet after Muhammad, and therefore they're violating the tenets of Islam. A second grouping, I'll go into these in more detail, is what I call actual apostates, someone who says, yeah, I was a Muslim, I'm not anymore. They may have converted to another religion, usually it's Christianity, or they've just become unbelievers. The third general category is Muslims of the wrong type, by which I mean if you're Sunni, Shia, or Sufi, in a situation where you're the minority. That's probably the largest, in numbers, the largest category of victims. And fourthly, Muslim religious and political reformers and dissidents. Comment on the Baha'is. Baha'is began in Iran in the 19th century and are accused of sort of denying the truths of Islam because they have a prophet after Islam. They have a difficult time in many Muslim majority contexts, especially so in Iran. These are the 7 major leaders of the Baha'i community in Iran. They were arrested in 2008, sentenced and imprisoned in 2010, and are due to be held till 2028. Also, because Baha'is are not a recognized religion in Iran, they have no legal status, which means there are no penalties for killing a Baha'i. They are legally non-persons. So if someone murders a Baha'i, there are no legal consequences. So then we have Ahmadis, who I mentioned. I'll go back. They have a tough time in many places, but especially so in Pakistan, where they're subject to very many attacks, and their mosques are bombed. In fact, they cannot use the term, they cannot call their places of worship a mosque. That's illegal. Also, if you're a Pakistani Muslim, in order to get a passport, one of the sections of the forms you fill out requires you to denounce the Ahmadis. If you go to the website of the Embassy of Pakistan in Washington, D.C., you will find that form on the website. So the former ambassador is a good friend of mine. He's a colleague now at Hudson. He always found that immensely embarrassing, but couldn't do much about it. So Baha'is and Ahmadis, and between them we're looking at probably in Iran and Pakistan, 1 million people. Then what I'm calling actual apostates, people who themselves would agree they've changed religion or dropped it. Just a few examples. Fazil Say, a Turkish concert pianist, and an atheist, an outspoken atheist. That's 2013, was given a 10-month sentence for tweets which were held to be denigrating religious values. Or another example, a very famous one, lousy photograph. You remember the case of Miriam Ibrahim in Sudan. She had an American husband. She was back in Sudan, and they discovered that she had been born a Muslim, so she was imprisoned and sentenced to death for apostasy. She gave birth while in prison, and this case dragged on. Subsequently, she was released in July of last year. But there are many instances of people of a Muslim background who converted to another religion and are attacked and may be sentenced to death or killed. The third category of victims is, just say, Muslims of the wrong type. That is, you're a Muslim, you're a Shia or a Sufi. Sufis could be either Sunnis or Shias. In a repressive place which upholds a different form of Islam. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, if you are a Shia, you have a rough time. If you're a Sufi, you can have a rough time. Shia, again, have problems in Egypt. Their leaders are imprisoned. There are killings in Pakistan. They're essentially forbidden in Malaysia. There are attacks on Shia also in Indonesia. On the other hand, Sunnis can have a difficult time in a place such as Iran. So again, this usually embraces, this puts penalties on millions of people. Just one example of photograph. After various Sufis, including dervishes, of whom you may have heard, were protesting the repression and imprisonment of their leaders in Iran over the last several years. And there was a peaceful demonstration by Sufis, which the police and mobs broke up quite viciously. She had her arm broken and several other things. Fourth category of who these victims are is Muslim religious and political reformers and dissidents. I want to say more about this because this is key in how we understand ways of combating radicalism or extremism in an Islamic context. And these current attacks on people accused of blasphemy or insulting Islam have major effects because they lead to the repression of, for want of a better term, Muslim moderates and give a louder voice to more radical voices. Example of what I mean. This man, an Afghan, Ali Mohakek Nasab, he was the editor of a magazine. Actually, the magazine was called Women's Rights, but this was Afghanistan, so there was a man who edited it. But Ali was a very courageous editor. And back in 2005, when it was discovered that a particular Afghan had become a Christian, and the parliament, and supported by the Karzai government, had him imprisoned, and there was an appeal to get him killed. This, by the way, is our ally Afghanistan, when the US Army was there in force. And in this magazine, Ali published 2 articles, and one said, is it really the case that Islam requires us to kill people who we think are apostates or converts? And the second article said, is it really the case that Islam requires us to stone adulterers? For publishing those 2 articles, he was accused of blasphemy and was imprisoned. And this particular case was a wake-up call for me because I was dealing with some of the cases of converts. But the realization that you cannot do anything about restrictions on sort of conversion or apostasy in Islam, or you cannot deal with the question of the status of women in places such as Afghanistan or Pakistan, or a variety of other questions, unless you are allowed to talk about them, unless you can discuss them. And restrictions on sort of criticizing Islam or insulting Islam have the major effect that the other issues cannot be talked about. So the possibility of reform, where reform is needed, is pushed away. And again, the people who are empowered are the more radical voices because they are the ones who throw out accusations of insulting Islam and so on. So the dealing with many other problems in contemporary extremism with Islam becomes impossible when you have these types of blasphemy restrictions because they forbid discussion of the issues. Take one other example, again, of a Muslim, Mohsen Kadivar, an Iranian scholar. He's been in prison for insulting Islam. What did he do? Well, as you probably know in background, that the system of government in Iran is historically very unusual. It's called the Vilayat al-Faqih. It basically means the people we call clerics rule and run the country. That is contrary to traditional Shiite positions. That was largely an innovation brought in by Khomeini. And Kadivar, being a much more traditionalist Shia scholar, wrote a 3-volume work called The Theory of the State in Shiite Jurisprudence. You know, this is not the sort of thing you'd find at the checkout counter at the supermarket. This was a large, dense, thorough legal review of traditional Shia positions on the role of clerics, Islamic jurists in the state. And he concluded that the present system of government in Iran, to quote, I'll quote a translation, has no foundation in Shiite jurisprudence. So that's what he argued. So the government said, well, that's insulting Islam. Why? We're an Islamic government. We represent Islam. So if you criticize us, you're criticizing Islam. So you can't do that. Grand Ayatollah Boroujerdi, who's near death in prison in Iran, for a similar position. So within Iran, apart from the sufferings of other people, Baha'is, Christian converts, Sufis and others in Iran, is people who dissent, particularly in this context, I'll call them theologians, clergy, scholars, who dissent from the government view, are hit with this type of accusation. So change within Iran becomes difficult. What many other examples in the Muslim world, I'll go back to some. These also affect Muslims in the West. 2 examples. Mimane Boussakla, she is a Belgian, she's a senator in the Belgian parliament, who has to travel with bodyguards because she's criticized things about the status of women in some Muslim communities in Belgium. So she is still talking, but she travels with bodyguards. Another one, Akin Delegos, the first Muslim member of the legislature in Germany, member of the Green Party, almost exactly the same situation. And maybe you've asked the question or heard others ask the question, why do so many Muslims stay quiet on these issues? Well, it's because they might get killed. And this is even in the West. Imagine if you happen to live in Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia. So just one more. Shahin Najafi, an Iranian rap singer in Germany, was recently in 2013 declared an apostate who must be killed. Again, many such examples could be killed of Muslims in the West who, if they speak out about these issues, are threatened or attacked. Also, if you look at the danger to the non-Muslims in the West, we are aware of the Charlie Hebdo situation, the situation of the Danish cartoons, the Swedish cartoons, and others, but they can become fairly widespread. Now, my mind's gone blank. Who can remember? There was a cartoonist, we'll go back to the Reverend in a minute, a cartoonist for the Seattle Weekly, and my mind has blanked, sorry, on her last name. First name, Molly, can you remember? Ivans, it'll come. Okay, somehow this has gone down the memory hole in the United States. When there was controversy about Muhammad cartoons, he said, let's get all the cartoonists together and have a Let's Draw Muhammad Day. She got threats, withdrew, apologized. FBI advised her that she should go into the equivalent of a witness protection program. So she resigned her position, has changed her name, given up being a journalist, a cartoonist, and has gone into hiding.
Molly Norris?
Molly Norris, thank you. Good. That was a test I wanted to see. Okay, Molly Norris. You remember that there have been plots against the lives of the producers of South Park on the Comedy Channel. So those are going on. This particular one, you might remember, of a threat to burning a Quran, or rather a threat to burn a Quran. And this sort of drew in everybody. We all remember our Florida pastor. But in this case, this is from Al-Qaeda's online magazine, Inspire. And a few of the people we have over here, Salman Rushdie, Fleming Rose, the editor of Yale and Poston, Lars Vilks, attempt on his life last Saturday, others, Geert Wilders, the Dutch politician, Kurt Vestergaard, another Swedish cartoon, Pastor Terry Jones, who you see over there, and Carlton Just, who is another, actually the editor of Yale and Poston. So there are death threats against those people on the internet. Again, we could mention many others. But I hope you're now beginning to get a sense of how widespread is the phenomenon we're talking about. These are not occasional assaults on cartoonists. Of course, the widest pattern is self-censorship. For each person who's imprisoned or threatened or beaten up or killed, there are hundreds or perhaps thousands who decide we're not going to go there. Usually they say, well, I'm too sensitive to do those things. But I'm not sure I believe that. Just a couple of sort of minor ones. January 9th, 2014, in an article in the New York Times, on a statue of Muhammad that until 1955 graced the rooftop of the Appellate Division Courthouse at Madison Avenue and 25th Street, New York, refused to show a photograph of the statue. This is a statue on a public building in New York. This was not an insulting statue. I mean, Charlie Hebdo is a pretty gross scatological magazine. But these were sort of respectful statues. But we're not putting those up. Another example. Sorry, this is stretched a bit to get it in, but that's the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. And there is a frieze which you see showing various lawgivers. One of them is Muhammad. He's holding a book and a scimitar. He stands between Charlemagne and Justinian, and just along the way from Hugo Grotius, William Blackstone, and John Marshall there. So that's currently on the Supreme Court building. With present trends, I think many of our newspapers would refuse to publish a picture of the US Supreme Court building which contained this. At least that's happened with another building here. So the pattern is getting wider and wider. It's not just insult and sensitivity. In sort of closing these up, and then let's open it up to discussion, let me go back to the point I made earlier, is the major danger of this is the suppression of debate, dissent, and renewal within Islam. As mentioned before, I'm a visiting professor at Sharif Hidayatullah Islamic State University, which is the largest Islamic State university in Indonesia. And I'm in the graduate school. The dean of that graduate school gets death threats for what he writes. He's a very careful, believing Muslim scholar. But he disagrees with a lot of radicals, and so this is what happens to Ajumadi. But here's a few others. This is, again, a Muslim, Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab. He was opposing Pakistan's blasphemy law and was demanding the release of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman still imprisoned for blasphemy and sentenced to death. He said the blasphemy laws in Pakistan are horrible. So he was accused of blasphemy for criticizing the blasphemy law. And so he was killed. We had his daughter speaking at Hudson a year or two back. And again, I want to embrace this particular point. The word liberal here can be understood very broadly. This isn't insulting. He said, in the Pakistan context, this is a warning to every liberal. Shut up or be shot. This went further, by the way. Unusually, the man who killed Taseer was tried. Usually they're not. And was sentenced to death, for which the judge was accused, not by the court, not by the state, by the people, of blasphemy. Why? Because you condemned to death a man who, because he criticized the blasphemy law, must have been a blasphemer. And then you get the question, can you defend the judge? Or would that be blasphemous? And we're starting to get here very like a Monty Python element. Or if you defended a person who defended the judge who sentenced to death a man regarded as a blasphemer because he opposed the blasphemy law. And there are other chains like this. So anyway, Taseer was killed. In conclusion, I'm going to quote another couple of authors in respect to this. The late Hafez Abu Zaid actually has a chapter in that book, Silence, we mentioned. He was charged with apostasy in Egypt because of his writings on the Quran. Says that the charges of blasphemy, insulting Islam, are key weapons in the fundamentalist arsenal, strategically employed to prevent reform of Muslim societies, and instead confine the world's Muslim population to a bleak, colorless prison of socio-cultural and political conformity. One other, the late Abdullah Ram Wahid, former president of Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country, and former president of Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the world's largest Muslim organization, some 40 or 50 million people. If I may put in and you ignore the guy in the very loud shirt there. Wahid actually wrote the foreword to the book Silenced, which will come out in Indonesia next month. He died recently, amazing man. And his foreword to the book Silence is now quite famous in its own right. It's called God Needs No Defense. It's actually a rap song in Indonesia with that title. But this is what, lost it. Anyway, Wahid was a strong defender of free speech and said, rather than give in to the fundamentalist demands, fundamentalism was his statement. He said, which will condemn us all. He said, Western societies should strongly uphold positions of free speech and freedom of religion and seek to get Muslim countries to do likewise. My basic theme is this, that when we look at questions of blasphemy or insulting Islam, not to get too fixated on the more sort of spectacular Western cases, but to realize we're dealing with a global phenomenon, very widespread, whose victims are not, most of whose victims are not Westerners, and most of whom, in any normal sense of the word, are not blasphemous and insulting, but merely disagreeing and arguing. So my conclusion is this. When politics and religion are intertwined, as they necessarily are in debates about blasphemy, then unless we can have religious debate, we cannot have political debate. Unless we have religious disagreement, we cannot have political disagreement. And unless we have religious freedom, we cannot have political freedom. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is this on? Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. I think we probably have a lot of questions in the room and at least 20 or 30 or 40 minutes to get into it. Is Dr. Bob Carl here? I thought maybe we'd start off with our professor who teaches a class on Islam as a respondent or a questioner, and then we'll take questions from the audience, so save up some good ones.
Hello. Thank you very much, Paul, for your lecture. Historically, Islam has been filled with debate, dissent, and renewal. And it seems that the last 30 years have been a particularly dark period for Islam. And how do we reverse this trend toward the growth of this murderous brand of Islam that seems to be engulfing so many parts of the world?
Okay, $24,000 question. I think the first thing to do is to be robust in defending freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of the press. For all the gross things. When people are free to do things, they do an awful lot of bad things. So that happens. But we need to stand up to that. For a variety of reasons, it's to do with something of the nature of human beings in terms of how we function and how we cannot function properly if too determined and control. Another reason is that from the evidence we have, restrictions on speech, and including the press and other things in here, do not work in terms of repressing bad motives. To give an example, many European countries, including France, have laws against anti-Semitic speech. The United States does not. Anti-Semitism is growing in leaps and bounds in the European countries where anti-Semitic speech is illegal. It's not doing so, at least not in leaps and bounds in the United States. So the laws don't appear to be having the desired effects. European laws against hate speech are very widespread. What do we see in Europe? The growth of fascist movements in many countries. So these laws don't have the desired effect. By the way, Weimar Germany had very strong laws against hate speech, which they sought to use against the Nazis. Not one of good methods. Those laws don't work, and they don't. I don't think they're correctly conception of justice respects a human person. We need to stand up and defend that. And to also say, along with Muslim allies, I was quoting Abu Zaid, Abdullah al-Mahdi, that these types of restrictions are one reason. There will be others why the countries in the Muslim world which have this level of restriction are usually highly repressive, highly corrupt, and unless they have a lot of oil, or so they introduce a closure in society, and that's damaging to Muslims. So to make our own arguments and not go around apologetic. And again, when people say, well, Westerners do this, that, and the other, forget, of the thousands of cases, less than 1% being done by Westerners. This is a phenomenon out there. So, know politically what we believe in these matters and be willing to defend it unashamedly and not pussyfoot around it. Secondly, work in cooperation with Muslims who support the same thing. Many of our governments, there's a tendency in opposing terrorists, want to team up with Muslims of very repressive views, but who are not terrorists. That is, they're non-violent, but still want very repressive forms of society. So I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood is a good ally in trying to fight Al-Qaeda or ISIS. But there are hundreds of millions of Muslims who want to defend freedom of religion. I have more restrictions than we do, or freedom of speech, but basically want open societies. And we should look for allies and work with people who are within the United States and overseas who are committed to similar things. So those are, that's in very general terms, but I mean, that's the sense we need to have.
Do we have another question? Yeah, right here.
There is the most commonly accurate interpretation of jihad is something like holy war. The word crusade is a pretty good translation of jihad. Which means, and we too can have a crusade against drugs and those sorts of things. We have a jihad against drugs. But the crusades in their original sense where you were actually involved in armed conflict. I recommend if you read James Turner Johnson on dealing with Islamic doctrines of war. And there you will find Also questions, in traditional just war theories, in jus ad bellum, right, reasons for going to war, jus in bellum, the way you fight. In classical Islamic doctrine, one would need to go beyond the Quran. The Quran is only a very small percentage of Islamic written revelation. The classical doctrines usually put limits, narrow, not as broad limits as we would probably want right now, but they do. So things that ISIS is engaged in would violate most of those restrictions. But making war to overcome infidels, that was a classical doctrine, and to rule over them. Not usually convert them. You don't want them to convert, but you could rule over them. But what you're getting now with ISIS or Al-Qaeda is introduce this sort of pragmatic element that if it helps us win, all the other rules go out the window.
Okay, let's crowdsource. Hello? Let's crowdsource a question for a change. So on the point of that you brought up, we need to reach out and encourage freedom of expression. There's another issue on the Charlie Hebdo front, which scatological and insulting magazine. The Twitter universe was debating after the murders at Charlie Hebdo, should the New York Times and other newspapers publish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons of Muhammad on the front page. And that was a huge debate on Twitter among journalism professors and free speech theorists. So let's take a poll in the room, okay? And then we'll ask Paul Marshall what he thinks. So raise your hand if you think the New York Times absolutely should have published the Charlie Hebdo cover depicting, or one of them depicting Muhammad on the front page the day after the murders. Raise your hand if you agree with that, or think they should have. Okay, how many, no, put your hands down. Raise your hand if you think that they probably shouldn't have published that on the front page. Okay, that's the majority. And who didn't vote or doesn't know is on the fence. Okay, all right, so let's ask the same question of Paul Marshall and hear his response. I'm sorry, you already might.
I am. I want to answer the question in terms of a background of some other thing. Abstractly, to put, it's kind of logical, not quite the word, but the sorts of cartoons, I mean, calling Charlie Hebdo a satirical magazine isn't quite the point. It's quite horrible cartoons, much of it. The question of whether or not you show those in a story about that, I probably wouldn't publish those. But I would have published a photograph in a story about a statue of Muhammad in New York. Published a photograph of that. For the Danish cartoon, what we call the Danish cartoon. By the way, Yale University Press published a book by Ethan Clausen on the Danish cartoons. But at the last minute refused to have a one-page showing the page of the newspaper. I would have shown those, or at least some of them. They're not particularly insulting, by the way. And many of them have no depiction of that at all. But I would have run those. And other background situation is you had the New York Times several years ago, I don't want to jump all of the time, but the big example brought up. With the Danish cartoons and other cases, the Times produced a thumbsucker. Is that an expression?
Yeah.
What do you do about it? Well, no, it just means, we're going to agonize over an issue. There.
Oh, okay.
And it was a naval gaze.
Yeah.
Hand-wringing, navel-gazing, other suggestions?
And it was about whether or not, and what it was is, basically, religious people often get insulted by showing images which are against their religion. The occasion for this was the Danish cartoons. It did put an illustration which many people found insulting. That was the famous painting of the Virgin Mary done out of elephant dung, which I think was in a museum in Brooklyn. which many Christians thought was blasphemous and so on. But the Times put this image up, the story, something which had occurred several years before on the occasion of a story, more immediate story in a Muslim context. So it published that, but not the others. One others just to shift to AP. You might know this question that AP said they would not have these things in its image bank and sell them or whatever it does because it doesn't believe in insulting images. And then someone pointed out, why are you still selling photographs of Serrano's Piss Christ? This is a crucifix in a jar of urine, which I think was Serrano's own. By the way, I have my own doubts whether the Marian elephant duck or Serrano are actually blasphemous. You need to look at much more of the output. But the issue here isn't whether they are. It's certainly many Christians thought they were blasphemous and horrible. AP was still selling those. Now, it stopped selling it the day that was raised. But that wasn't an issue before. So my background element is that there are a variety of other images which are sort of less insulting or less hurtful, or perhaps not hurtful at all, but of historical and useful value, which are not getting published. So I get very skeptical in the case of this, is saying, well, we don't want to upset people. Well, you've been doing that. So I would say, if I was the editor of the Times, I wouldn't have put those on the front page. But I would have published probably most of the other things we're talking about. And my worry is this sort of blanket suppression of these images.
I got several follow-ups on that, but I want to open it up to more questions. Any hands out there with a question? Yeah, in the back here, Josiah.
So I've been trying to formulate the question, but in supporting Charlie Hebdo, the whole I am Charlie, I was wondering if that is the appropriate response, because you are affiliating with the very vulgar people. Could there have been a way to support their freedom of speech without necessarily associating yourself so closely with them and their message? I'm wondering if that was the most effective way that we could have responded to this situation, and or did that? Could we have done it in such a way to encourage free speech? Because my impression is that it hasn't done much within the Muslim society. Saying, well, I'm Charlie too, hasn't made them feel any better or feel any differently about free speech.
Yeah, my own view, not to condemn all those people who so sincerely did, I am Charlie, whatever, that doesn't seem to me an exercise in politics, but in narcissism. You're not Charlie. You weren't killed, you weren't shot at, you weren't anything. It's like these Twitter things, release the girls or any of those sorts of things. These are not political things, they're sort of statements of holding up a side. Say, we want to defend free speech. We will defend free speech. That's hard in France because France has lots of laws limiting free speech. I don't know whether you know that Brigitte Bardot has been convicted 3 times under French law for insulting Muslims. And as I mentioned before, the great historian Bernard Lewis can't go to France because of his conviction they said he was denying the Armenian genocide. So in France will crack down on lots of things. So the Europeans can get very hypocritical on this score, and Muslims notice that one. Say, well, you can't do that, you can't insult this, you can't insult that, but you're allowed to do that. So I would push very strongly on questions of freedom of speech, including Holocaust denial or denial of the Armenian genocide. I don't like people who do either of those things. But it's not the business of the government to pass laws defining what history is. So I would say, no, we stand up for freedom of speech, and we stand up for freedom of the press. I would have just done it that way. The sort of faux identification, I don't think, doesn't do a lot for me.
The Charlie Hebdo event, and I see Terry Mattingly's hand going up, so I want your comment. If you have a comment, Terry, too? I have a question. All right. Let me see if I hit the same thing, otherwise we'll tag team this. when journalists or cartoonists are killed, it makes creative people angry. It makes journalists blood boil and other cartoonists blood boil. And in fact, there's a group of cartoonists that started doing cartoons about Charlie Hebdo, drawing pictures of Muhammad, and there's the 300. I got an email that we can actually display some. I don't know if we got them up. I was asking someone to curate a selection of 20 not too offensive ones to put up, but they're encouraging college campuses to put these up in solidarity, other acts of creativity. And so I'm wondering, okay, so here's a follow-up. I sort of agree that the I Am Charlie was a little bit strange just logically, for the same reasons you said, but what should we do, okay? In announcing to a couple of my classes about your lecture and that we should attend, I decided to draw 2 stick figures on the board. And then I drew, not on this board, but in the classrooms, and then drew a beard and labeled one Jesus and one Muhammad. Is that idolatry, or is that taking a step toward free expression? Should we, all of us, make snowmen, Muhammad snowmen, or encourage graffiti artists to draw Muhammad, or to feel free to do so, or other religious figures? Because one thing I read said that to be consistent, radical Islamists should attack people for drawing a picture of Jesus or Abraham or Moses, because they're also prophets in Islam, right? Oh, it has happened.
Yeah. So, insults against Jesus. In England, I'd need to check the details on this one. There are a lot of cases. There was a play in London which showed Jesus in a very bad light. And if any of you older people remember the English puppet show, Spitting Image, on TV, okay, they had things on Jesus. The Church of England and others protested, and the BBC all got lost. And then some Muslims said, Jesus is not only, for us, not only a prophet, but a messenger of God. And you're insulting him. And the BBC dropped it. We get those things happening. Again, I want to push because here we're concentrating, and this is the case, and there are journalists who are killed for doing this. But on the question of insult here, and one of my major points is most of these things are not insults. It's cutting down argument. So I would want to push for free speech. A couple of avenues here. Whole other lecture could be brought here. I mentioned the organization of the Islamic Conference, now the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. This has been pushing in the United Nations on and off since 1990, but systematically since 1998, to have international laws against insulting Islam. We used to say insulting religion, but it's against insulting Islam. And I regard this as simply an attempt to export their own repression on the rest of the world. As you mentioned, that's a new phenomenon. To quote Bernard Lewis, before Rushdie, says, at no time and anywhere in Muslim history have Muslims thought Islamic law should be applied to non-Muslims living in non-Muslim countries. So this was a new thing. So this is growing. The OIC is pushing for it to resist it. And the US government is not doing this. And I don't just mean under the Obama administration, it was the same under Bush. That we've had several sort of anti-extremism exercises with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And a lot of them have been exercises in us saying, here's America, how bad we are. And then countries in the OIC saying, yeah, that's true, you are bad. The last one under Hillary Clinton, which was, going December 2012, the Saudi representative was denouncing what the Americans were doing in American Islamophobia. On the same day, the Saudis beheaded someone for sorcery. So in these things, no, push back with the OIC and saying, no, what we're doing can be very useful in society, and many of your problems stem from the fact that you don't do that and you're trying to export them. So stand up robustly for freedom of speech and freedom of the press and criticism. And let's not just focus on much more insulting things. And Charlie Hebdo is the extreme of that. It's a bit like Quran burning. I don't believe it should be illegal, but some people who go around burning Qurans, I think they're horrible people.
On the First Amendment front, I have a question. Students here will remember that last year there was National Equality Day, where a lot of people changed their Facebook icon to a pink equal sign. And this went on and on and on. And during that day, I changed my overarching Facebook image to be the First Amendment. At which point, more than a few of my former students from Christian colleges and universities shot me emails in which they accused me of hate speech for posting the First Amendment on that day. Which leads to my question. How did a liberal interpretation of the First Amendment become a conservative cause?
These are all very large questions. You have a usual pattern that people who are, let's use the example, often religious minorities push very strongly for religious freedom. When they cease being minorities, or at least get in positions of power, will they still push for religious freedom for their opponents? So you've had a shift of power relations. That people who thought that they would benefit from a very strong and forceful interpretation of the First Amendment now think other people are benefiting from it. And so your support for it weakens. That is, whose ox is getting gored? So they think it's not going to hurt, it's going to hurt them less than it's going to hurt conservatives. There is, I mean, the rhetoric is going in funny directions, and as we've seen in Europe and here, laws can change very quickly. But the US has no restrictions on hate speech. It's not a legal category in the United States, and nor at the federal level have we ever had such. That's a European category. It's not an American legal category. We have what we call sort of hate crimes, where things you have said may be brought in as evidence for motivation of the crime, but which I don't like that either. But the question is what you're being punished for is a particular act, not for the things you've said. So we don't have that particular element, and I would want to defend it very strongly. And so far, the courts have been pretty strong on that. But simply a shift in power relations.
So there's this continuum of extreme freedom, as First Amendment, U.S. law, freedom of expression, religion, press, and then extremely restrictive laws, and then this line of what's appropriate. Mm-hmm. I sort of feel maybe we should turn the spotlight back on Christianity for a moment in a couple of ways. One, if there's questions on this, I know one of our professors gave a lecture, Dr. Antonova gave a lecture on iconography and the history of the church, mm-hmm. Related a little bit to images mm-hmm. as blasphemy. And so that's something interesting. How did Christianity change from that? And then the thing you touched on with modern art, when you have a crucifix in a glass of urine, what's interesting to me is a lot of us, I think probably most of the people in the room would probably think that was offensive or inappropriate, although we might want to look at the context of the work and what the artist mm-hmm. was doing. And personally, growing up, getting fundraising letters from all kinds of Christian organizations, using those as examples of the decline of America and everything, mm-hmm. I think that I wonder, does the response, how we respond to this kind of thing when our own religion is portrayed in a way we don't like, affects how we view modern art? That we throw the baby out with the bathwater of modern art, I think was what was happening in a lot of parts of the U.S. and evangelical America. Those are the two interesting things I see.
Yeah.
Answer it in 140 characters.
Yeah.
A very good friend of mine, Ed Nippers. Do you know Ed's work? He's had his painting. He's a very committed Christian artist. Does a lot of biblical scenes, and all his figures are always naked. He's had his paintings attacked by more fundamentalist Christians, physically attacked and ripped by fundamentalist Christians. So the question of interpretation of art is difficult, but that's not my area, except I will agree that for many Christians, the understanding of art is extremely limited. I only ever took one course in aesthetics from my friend Calvin Seerveld, and he was dealing with Serrano, at least. He did not think that was Serrano's portraying what we are doing. But yeah, there's a problem with modern art. Just remind me of another thing, going back to Facebook and the First Amendment, of moving into some of the dangers in America post Charlie Hebdo. So far, First Amendment, in terms of First Amendment is being upheld very strongly by the courts with respect to speech. With respect to religion, we're getting quite iffy here. But of course, that only applies to the government. If Facebook decides to censor you, if Google decides on its searches you're not going to show up, if Apple or other people do it, most of our most of the limitations on our communication are not coming from the government. So you could find yourself sidelined very easily going into modern art and other questions. But again, on the Islamic discussions, Facebook has already done some things on that score. So this, in the United States, that's the biggest danger I see.
I see Udo Middleman here with a question. By the way, here's a guy students should make an appointment to see, who's on our campus this semester, Udo Middleman from Europe.
Maybe after I say something, you don't want to see me. I have a comment to make and then a question. The comment is, isn't it interesting that every totalitarian system is afraid of freedom, of the inquisitiveness of its members, whether that is the secular system that Mr. Putin is reinstating, or whether that is a religious system, as in Islam, or whether that is a fundamentalist church somewhere in this country. We don't want people to question things, because then we lose control. That's a common phenomenon, unhappily. My question is, we do have, other than our own religious basis, a justification to precisely insist on the freedom of people to ask questions, and that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all these countries have signed. However, we have not done enough to protest, for instance, the Saudi interpretation of human rights, where in the Vienna Congress, whenever 15 years ago or so, they said, well, we see it differently, and we accepted that the father, the man, is the ruler of the house, and so forth and so on, and the women don't have a word to say, and we don't tolerate any kind of debate. Among these rights, for this Declaration of Human Rights, I don't see the right to not be insulted. And so, why do we not use that more commonly accepted Universal Declaration of Human Rights to insist on human rights for Muslim women, for Muslim children, and so forth and so on? And on the other hand, in relationship to the art, why do we not say, well, you don't have to enjoy the cartoon, but you don't have a right to be protected against your feeling that this is unacceptable. And that goes for us Christians as well.
Okay. A couple of things more. Let's just change. I think Saudi is the only country in the world which is not a central university. But I would agree with you very strongly on some of these themes. In Article 18 on freedom of religion, it's very good definition, very broad and sweeping, and I think it hits the basis. So it's a pretty good document. By the way, as an aside, often the UN Declaration of Human Rights, with these sort of, so to speak, social and economic rights, the civil and political rights, people usually say it was a standoff, a compromise between the communists and the liberals. This was not the case. If you see most people John Humphreys, who was the secretary of the drafting commission, wrote a book on the creation of that. He said, no, he says the major debates in that room were between the Catholics and the communists, with the communists a very poor second. To a large degree, this is a Catholic document, or Catholic-inspired document. Jeff Valentine chaired the earlier preparatory committees. Charles Mallock had a lot of input into that. So I think those are good documents and want to use them, and particularly as it's been fleshed out in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Most of these countries have signed that, so we can and do use that. But they put reservations saying it's not going to be applied. In the Muslim context, one of the problems is they have what they now call the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which it says Universal Declaration and the Universal Covenants are Western. We want a Muslim one. And essentially it says all these things are granted subject to the law, but the law in Arabic, they're Sharia. That is, all these things will apply subject to Sharia, which means that Sharia is the controlling element. So that debate is still going on. It's not a very strong legal argument, but it's in there. And
it's not universally.
Well, no, it isn't, and it's not even a regional. I mean, there's an inter-American covenant on dealing with rights. There's African law and so on, but this is a sort of religiously based law, and so that's where the sort of counter push is beginning to come in. But I think it's important to appeal to those documents which people have signed. And then another thing is to appeal as much as we can here in a Muslim context to more universal arguments. You know, things from the nature of the human person, that question about freedom. There are limits to every form of freedom, but freedom is intrinsically to the person. In terms of the nature of religious freedom, to have a faith which is not free seems to be incoherent. How can that be your faith? So, in the context, particularly of my teaching in Indonesia, those are some of the themes I want to develop. And again, in the Muslim context, you know, lots of an increasing number of you know, Muslim authors writing in defense of freedom of religion and other things of this kind.
That was an excellent question to end on. It's kind of solution-oriented, and we are 10 minutes away from a lot of students going to their next class, so it's a good place to end. And let's thank Paul Marshall once again for this.